It says we're live.
Awesome.
All right.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good afternoon. Good evening and good day to everyone out there who's watching this Explearning live stream now in real time or afterwards for the replay because we leave them up.
Yes, we do. It's been a stormy week on the northeast of America.
Yeah, a lot of storms, mini tornadoes, power outages, different things going on with the weather. So
keeping things interesting.
Hopefully we don't cut out.
Yeah.
I don't think there's a storm today, but who knows? Maybe in other parts of the world.
Yeah. So what's our topic today?
Our topic is about communicating with empathy and compassion, which is really important. And we put out a video earlier this week, well, actually yesterday, about how to communicate with empathy when you're in a remote work situation. Because when you're, how do you show empathy from a longer distance when you might not actually see the person face to face? Right?
It's similar in some ways to the previous topic we had on humanizing your connections remotely, right?
Yeah.
And humanization of your interactions, your virtual reactions, is a very broad topic. What we're going to do today is really hone in on specifically the empathetic aspects of our interactions.
Exactly. And it's so important because when you're communicating with empathy, you actually get across to the person much better and they get across to you much better if you're the one going through different emotions at the time. It helps us build rapport. It helps us create trust with the person. It helps us bond. It helps us feel closer.
Right.
It can even help us with negotiating, right? So if you think of like a business setting, a professional setting, and I want to just pause for a second and talk about that because I think, a lot of times when we talk about empathy and communicating empathically and empathetically, same meaning, empathetic and empathic, there's this kind of notion that that's not professional. There's not a place for that in professional communication, which is actually patently false. Of course, there is a space for empathetic communication across all settings, be it personal, casual, professional. So it's really important to nurture this skill because we use it in all facets of life.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, when you take empathy out of your communication process,
right,
you take out a significant component of what establishes effective communication, right? So that's a roundabout way of saying you can't communicate clearly without having some empathy, because what empathy does is establishes, we were talking about this last time, some kind of basis of understanding between you and the people you're interacting with, or person, singular or plural, right? But it establishes this rapport, and this likeness, right? It's an understanding that you establish between each other, and that facilitates a much clearer and smoother process of communication.
Absolutely, yeah. And so one of the big things with empathy is, well, it's the confusion between empathy and sympathy. So let's quickly run through some examples.
Yeah.
And you actually found a really nice sort of, what was it? It was like a video clip.
Yeah, it was a short animation, YouTube animation. What was, do you remember?
I think it was from Brene Brown.
Okay, yeah. Beautiful sort of informal sketching type animation, but really powerful messages, pithy.
Yeah.
And we should probably put the link maybe in the show notes.
We can link it, yeah.
But they did a really nice job of delineating sympathy and empathy, because
they can get confused.
Exactly.
I think,
yeah, they're easily confused, but they're actually very different. And the director, author of this short, was clearly very pro empathy and not wild about sympathy. And the way she positions this is you have, it was like a little mole living underground. I can't remember the animals.
I think it was a fawn.
Okay, maybe it was a fawn.
I think it was a fawn.
Okay, and this fawn is really sad.
Distraught,
right? really unhappy.
Could really use some empathy.
And
at the moment.
so she's down, in her cave, and it's like essentially raining on her. She's sad, and the first person to come down is a bear, a friendly bear.
No, I think that was the friendly bear was the nice one.
The friendly bear, yes.
Okay.
So the first one to come down
Yes.
is the friendly bear, and the friendly bear, again, it's raining, and the bear comes and sits down next to the fawn and holds a little umbrella, which creates a little pocket of dry air, right? Respite from the
little haven.
a little haven, right?
Yeah.
A comfort zone. The bear doesn't really say much, just sort of sits there with the fawn. And that is empathy, right? You're there with the person in that moment, not necessarily rationalizing anything, not necessarily explaining anything. You're just there as a presence, a human presence. Yeah. Then sympathy pops its head in, and sympathy is this goat.
Goat, that's right.
I think it's
yeah,
a goat.
I think it was
Is it a goat or a sheep? Or I think it was a goat.
Yeah.
And looks down into the hole and is like, that looks bad, right? And they basically, what a sympathist will do, someone who's showing sympathy, is they will point out that that's a bad situation and say, well, that looks like it sucks.
That's too bad.
That's too bad for you.
Sucks for you.
Yeah. But there's no real emotional connection.
No.
They identify the problem, but identifying the problem in this case isn't necessarily going to fix it, right?
Right. I think they exacerbate the problem too, because, there's a line between the positivity and the toxic positivity. And that's kind of like, oh, that's too bad. Like, better luck next time, right? These are things that are not, we don't want to hear those, especially in that moment when we're feeling down and it's raining on us.
Yeah. And we often know why we're unhappy. And that's not to say that it isn't worth, we talk a lot about, spending time to identify the problem and then address it. This is a little bit separate.
Yeah.
This is in a stage where you're aware of what the problem is, but you're past that, and now you want to sort of cope with the problem, right? You want to learn to manage the problem, and to have someone come in and say, "Oh, that's a problem. You're going to have to figure out how to fix that."
Right.
Doesn't really, or even if someone's giving solutions, that doesn't necessarily help. Whereas this bear is just there, and the presence of being there and saying, I understand how you feel.
Right.
I'm here with you.
And here's an umbrella.
Here's an umbrella,
you.
right?
Yeah.
That's empathy. It's this more nebulous, but at the same time, more meaningful type of connection you can have with a person. And you can feel it, right? I think of sympathy as more an analytical, rational approach to a problem.
Right.
Empathy is a feeling of the problem, and it's establishing this sort of mental or heart to heart with the person that you're empathizing with.
Right. And sometimes you can even be spurred into action and take out that umbrella, right? Sometimes it's about understanding the thoughts of the person going through whatever they're going through and showing empathy by understanding, like, cognitively.
Right.
Sometimes it's emotionally, like saying, you can feel, even if you're having a great day, if your best friend is in a rut and they're crying and they're really sad, you might start crying and feel really sad too, right? That's a type of empathy. It's an emotional empathy. And then there's the other type of empathy, which is like the compassionate empathy. And that is what spurs someone to action. And so I think the example of that would be like taking out the umbrella, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Following it up somehow.
Following it up, right. Yeah, I like that. I like that contrast. And, another way to think of the difference between sympathy and empathy.
Right.
Sympathy is sort of one way. It's unidirectional, right?
Yeah.
One person expresses sympathy to the other. Mm-hmm. Empathy is this bi-directional process, right? Where the two people that are, expressing the empathy,
right,
it's sort of a circular motion, right?
It's like
The
a
person-
back and forth.
It's a back and forth.
Reciprocal. I
It's
like
a
that.
reciprocal. It's reciprocal,
I like
right?
that, yeah.
It's two directional.
Yeah.
And that's because there's a lot of sharing going on.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, that's what communication is, right? Communication is sharing something maybe that's in your head and bringing it to someone else's head, right? It is this bi-directional process. Communication is a process of talking to someone, but also listening, right?
Exactly.
And empathy is a very good representation of what communication is more broadly. Empathy is this back and forth of sharing of how one feels and the other expressing their understanding of how that feels.
Exactly. It's we have that adage about being in another person's shoes, right? It's that idea, right? It's a conditional because we can't ever be in someone else's shoes physically, right? You're in your own shoes, but you can still feel the sensations they're feeling just by being in close proximity to them, knowing them, understanding what they're going through. It's understanding emotions and feelings.
Yeah.
And that's really important because, like you said, that's where that listening comes in. And oftentimes people think, well, if I'm going to be a good communicator, I need to speak well. I need to be eloquent. I need to be persuasive. That is true, but that's only half the equation. Right? We can't neglect the other half, which is the listening part. And that is extremely important, especially in times where, a situation calls for empathetic listening, empathic listening, right? And being active about it, not passively listening, twiddling your thumbs, like, going through the motions of pretending to be there for someone, like, I'm there for you. But then meanwhile, you're thinking about what you're going to have for dinner or the exercise you're going to do that you're excited for, right? It's really engaging all of your senses and trying to decipher what's going on if that is not voiced to you, right?
Yeah, I think of it as trying to relate to what the person's going through. Because once you can start to recreate in your head what that person is feeling, essentially you're stepping into their shoes is the phrase. You can start to experience the emotions that they're feeling. And once you start to feel the emotion that they're feeling, they can sense that too, right?
Totally.
We're cued to identify these sort of emotional shifts in people.
Yeah, and the subtleties.
And the subtleties of this. And so a person knows when you can feel what they're feeling. They can sense it as well. And as soon as they sense that, they can open up even more. And that improves the fluidity of sharing this information.
Yeah, definitely.
Right? Yeah.
And, related to that, as we practice active listening and empathetic listening, it's really important to cast judgments aside, right? The empathetic communication zone is the no judgment zone, the judgment-free zone.
Yeah.
Right? Because the person wants to feel acknowledged and validated, right? These are themes we brought up in the humanizing the interactions lesson. Because again, it's related. These are all related. But it's really the idea of casting your judgment aside, not making assumptions, because if you're making assumptions, you're not taking in the full picture and you're not listening, right? So it's so important to, it's easy to judge. Humans are quick to judge because we have to process information and categorize it and box it and, store it away and tuck it away. But resist the urge to do that, right? If somebody is telling you and they're confiding in you, you might, judge them a little bit in your mind, but refrain from that, right?
Yeah, I think it's very important. And I like what you said. If you're making assumptions, then you haven't listened. Because assumptions are essentially filling the gap between the information you have and what reality is, right? So assumptions are a bridge that you're building. It's kind of like an artificial bridge. If you're instead listening, then you don't need to build an artificial bridge. You can build the bridge with the real information that they're giving you. And this isn't about fact. facts, right? Emotions aren't about facts.
True.
If someone says they're feeling a certain way, if they're feeling that way,
That's a fact that they feel that way.
Right.
It's their fact.
It's their reality.
It's their reality.
Yeah. So instead of trying to convince them that reality is different than the way they're feeling, which is something I have a habit of doing, that's not empathy, right? That's maybe it's sympathy, or it's a solution-oriented approach.
Yeah.
Which when someone needs empathy, that's not going to work.
Right.
So instead of trying to say you're feeling this, but really you should be feeling this, don't do that. Instead, what you say is, wow, let me see if I can understand the way you're feeling, right? And this doesn't require you to be a psychologist. You don't have to know the names for everything they're feeling, or specifically be able to categorize it. The point is simply you want to get on the same page with them mentally, right? You want to feel that emotional resonance that they're feeling. And if you don't have the vocabulary or the sort of pedagogical underpinning or foundation for understanding what that means, that's fine. The most important thing is that you get the information you need from them to understand the way they're feeling.
Yeah.
And once you've gotten to the point of just understanding the way they feel, you've done your job essentially, right? You don't really have to go beyond that. It's so powerful to be next to someone who knows the way you're feeling. And that happens so infrequently that when it does happen, particularly in a hard, difficult time, like, when you need empathy, you feel this, enormous sort of relief.
Yeah.
Because you're not alone in your, could be grief, could be anxiety, could be fear. Once you know that you're sharing it with someone else, it's just a weight off your shoulders. So as the person expressing the empathy, right, the person who's providing the empathy, by simply getting on the same emotional page as them, you've essentially done your job. You don't need to take it further than that.
I love that. You can imagine like the wavelength, right? The radio wavelength. You're syncing up to their frequency.
Exactly.
And you might be going like this, and they might be going like this, and then all of a sudden you're going in the same direction.
Totally.
And that's just a beautiful way of sort of, visualizing it, because essentially that's what you're doing.
Yeah. If you've ever tuned a guitar, I'm not a guitar player myself, but I've listened. I had a lot of friends.
You're very musical though, so I'm sure you could.
And actually, I do play piano, and pianos are another sort of chord related instrument in terms of they have these steel strings that get hit with a hammer, and a guitar you pluck it with your finger. But the point is, when you're tuning, whether it is a piano or a guitar. And you pluck the strings, you can tell when they're slightly out of tune. Out of tune, exactly. Yeah. And as you start to zero in on the perfect tune, it goes from this sort of discordant sound to this beautiful melodious. Yeah, exactly. It's just a really pure vibration. It's beautiful. Almost. And that's what empathy is. When you can dial into that person's chord, right? That frequency, like you're saying, it thrums with like warm energy.
I love that. That makes me feel all warm and fuzzy. So, these are important things to keep in mind when you're communicating with someone. And it's not, vulnerability is not showing weakness. There is strength in vulnerability, right? If you can be vulnerable, so thinking about now the other side of the communication exchange, right? If you're the person who needs the empathy, we all need empathy, obviously, right? We're human. If we're the person at the time on the, the side that needs the empathy in that moment, we're showing vulnerability essentially, and that's okay, right? There's strength in that. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind when you're, opening yourself up to someone. And if there's someone who, you can confide in and you can trust, or you're building rapport with, right? Don't be ashamed to show that side of you. Don't be ashamed to ask for help or to motion that you need, a shoulder to cry on or an umbrella, right? When it gets rainy.
What a great point, right? In order to receive empathy from someone else, it requires you to open up, right? Because again, if the person who wants to express empathy, if their goal is to do that, they have to. Their goal is to sort of understand your emotional context, and the only way they can get there is if you reveal it to them,
Yeah.
right? You need to show them the context, provide the information. They need to get on your wavelength, right? It's like giving them the instructions, giving them your frequency. And it might need some calibration. So be patient, right? Don't expect the person whom you're speaking to immediately understand where you're coming from.
Right.
All right. Emotions are complex, and sometimes what you're feeling doesn't necessarily align in a conventional way with the context that you're feeling it, right? Which is why often people are like, "Oh, you shouldn't be feeling that. You should be feeling something else because in this
You should
situation,
be happy right now."
right.
Like,
In this situation, everyone always feels this way.
Right.
It's like, guess what? I don't.
not like that.
And it's on you then to communicate to the person you're speaking with why you feel the way you. Not even to say why you feel, just how you feel.
Just say what you
Yeah,
feel.
and you don't
right?
necessarily need to know why, and that's why I took that back because I don't think you need to know why.
Yeah,
the why is too difficult.
Well, sometimes you do, like you said, and sometimes you don't. And it's all about, understanding. I think the way we can become more empathetic towards others is by becoming more empathetic towards ourselves, believe it or not.
That's interesting.
And understanding our own emotions. Like, we might feel sad, but the source of that sadness could be different each time. Right. And the spectrum of sadness, right? There might be super, super duper sadness, and there might be like minimal sadness, So it's really important to understand our own emotions as best we can, but know that we might not always know why we're feeling something.
Totally.
Right? And being okay with that.
That's exactly what I was thinking. And one of the ways you can get better at this as the person who's seeking empathy, and we should all seek empathy because it feels so good, to be empathized with. One of the ways you can improve your ability to receive empathy is to expand your emotional vocabulary, right?
To be able to identify it.
To be able to identify and
something.
articulate what it is you're feeling.
Okay.
And again, the why is less important. You can get to the why eventually, but oftentimes the most important thing is to first be able to articulate the way you're feeling. And if you think about a child, one of the biggest struggles that a child has and why they ultimately just resort to screaming is because it's very difficult for them to articulate what they're feeling.
Right.
And what's interesting is, I think we might have mentioned this before, but the sense of excitement and happiness is actually very similar to the sense of fear and anxiety, right? The chemicals that go through your body when you feel those emotions are very similar.
Yeah.
And so for a kid, they almost can't tell the difference between whether they're happy and excited or they're afraid, right? And
nervous.
Or nervous.
Yeah.
And the nuance is so precise that they don't have the vocabulary to articulate that nuance.
Right.
And as we get older, we get a little more sophisticated, but it still takes a lot of practice, right?
I think so.
If you're not in the habit of identifying the way you're feeling and articulating it, it can still be very challenging, right? There's not often space or places or people with whom you can articulate the way you're feeling.
Right.
And so we don't necessarily have a lot of practice doing that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, the idea along with that is that people might expect you to act a certain way and to be a certain way, and they've pigeonholed you into, a certain character or type of person or personality. And when you veer from that and when you're not that, it can be so startling to them that they don't know what to make of it.
Right.
Right. But that's not to say that you still shouldn't express those emotions. Like, we can't really control how people view us. Of course, there is image control, but there's only so much that we can do, right? So to try to go beyond that and try to make everyone happy and have everyone like you and have everyone see you in the most, perfect light is just not realistic. And it's just taxing on you as well, emotionally and mentally. And so don't be afraid of defying those, what's the word I'm looking for? Not stereotype per se, but the way that somebody has labeled you.
Conformity, maybe.
The conformity, like, for example, you might be known as the happy person. Yeah, well, guess what? You're not always happy. You might be sensitive sometimes. You might be, angry sometimes. We all are, right? So if someone says to you, right, and you're trying to open up and they say, well, you're such a happy person, you'll get over it.
Right. It doesn't help.
Think again. It's not, the best way
that would be the not empathy, right?
Yeah.
An empathetic response would instead be, "Oh, I'm sorry that you're unhappy. Tell me what it is you're feeling. Explain to me your situation, right?
Yeah.
Trying to get on the wavelength. That's regardless of whether that person is normally happy or not.
Right.
And in fact, if someone is normally happy and is unhappy, it probably means it's even more important to empathize with them because it's not something they're accustomed to. And I agree with you. I think people often view themselves as a certain type of person, and therefore they shouldn't be feeling
the other things
that they're feeling at that time. And that can be particularly distressing because there's this clash between who I think I am and the way I'm currently feeling. And at the end of the day, there's no way you can change there's no way you can change what you're feeling in that moment. Mm-hmm. You can employ strategies to start to work toward a different sensation.
Yes.
But in that moment, if you're unhappy, if you're anxious, if you're angry, right, you're feeling those emotions, and that's just a fact. Yeah. Like we're saying, there's no silver lining to that. And so at that moment, if someone else can empathize with that emotion, that's what you need.
That's what you need at the time.
And then after that, once you've received that empathy, then you can start to work toward, strategies toward mitigating and remediating those emotions.
Right.
The solution.
Yeah.
But step one is just recognizing the emotion that you're experiencing, acknowledging it, not fighting it because you're feeling it. Yeah. And as soon as you start to acknowledge and embrace what it is you're feeling, I'm not trying to run from it, that increases the sort of flow of your thoughts and your mind, and particularly if you have someone to help you facilitate that, that can really help relieve some of the pressure that builds up from these emotions.
Exactly. So these are all things to keep in mind when you're, processing your own emotions, which will help inform the way that you interact with someone who might not be able to process their emotions. And the big thing is acknowledging and validating, because that really makes somebody feel better, right? It's like, I got you. Here's an umbrella, right? Yeah. You're not going to get rained on right now. Not under my watch.
Yeah. And I think the big takeaway here is that empathy is a critical part of communication. It exemplifies communication in that it's a bi-directional process. And like you were saying, it really requires participation on both sides, right? For the person expressing empathy, they need to be listening, and then responding empathetically, right? So they have to be providing the empathy, and then the person who needs the empathy needs to be communicating what they're feeling clearly enough so that the person listening can understand them, and then provide the empathy they need.
And then after you have that heart to heart, and you're unpacking emotions, and you're sitting under your umbrella, metaphorically or not, it brings people closer together. It creates the rapport, and it has a lasting effect, right? So, these are things to also keep in mind when we're trying to nurture and foster kindred spirits, and to show compassion and to show that kindness when somebody might be verbalizing that help and vocalizing that or not, right? There's so much that we see just in someone's facial expressions and body language. 93% of that, of what we understand about someone in their communication, comes from the tone of voice and our body language, right?
Yeah.
And the 7% is the word. So even if someone's not saying anything to you, you still have 93% of data that you can, glean
Gather.
and gather.
Yeah.
Right. So these are really powerful tools that we, should put to use so that we can become more empathetic towards ourselves and towards the people around us.
Yeah. And as with any of these social skills, right, this is something you can practice on.
Yeah.
And the more effort and concerted sort of attention you direct toward your emotional vocabulary
Right.
and expressing empathy, in a
Yeah.
conscious way,
Yeah.
the better you'll get at it, and the better you'll ultimately communicate with people, both when you're seeking to communicate with them and when they're seeking to communicate with you.
Exactly. So all good things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us this lovely Saturday. This is always, it's great to have some time to interact with you all. And we love it when you chime in as well.
Yep.
Now or in the comments. So, if you have challenges with empathy, or it's something you think you're good at and have some tips to share with people, definitely do that. That's the point of this community, is to enrich
Yes.
everyone's understanding.
Definitely. And if just to, echo what Greg said, if you recently showed empathy towards someone
Yeah.
or they showed it to you, feel free to share that with us.
And how it felt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We love hearing from everyone.
Cool.
Yep.
All right.
So that's a wrap for today. And we will see you all next week for another lesson and another live stream. Comment. What other topics do you want us to unpack? What other things do you have questions about? And we will get back to you.
Thanks for joining, guys.
Happy exploring, everyone.
Catch you next time.